Well, good morning. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear. Though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose stream makes glad the city of God, a holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar. Kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice. The earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see the works of the Lord, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow. He shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in all the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Do you know this God? I mean, really, do you know this God? Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 23 and 24 says, "This is what the Lord says. Let not the wise man boast of his wisdom, or the strong man boast of his strength, or the rich man boast of his riches. But let him who boasts boast about this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness, for in these I delight, declares the Lord. Do not boast about how wise you are, or how intellectually smart you are, or how strong you are, or how talented you are, or how rich you are. You have one boast in this life, and it is that you know Christ, that you are doing everything you can to make him known among all the nations." As we come to this text this morning, it causes so many questions to pop up. And there are two main questions that we have to ask when we come to Matthew 24, verses 1 through 35. First of all, do you know Christ? Do you know Christ in all his grandeur, and all of his terror, and all his glory, and all his wrath, and all his love, and all his mercy, and all his grace? If you truly do, then this passage this morning should delight you. But if you don't truly know him, this passage should terrify us. As we go through this passage this morning, I want every single person here to look at your response to this passage in your heart. If your response is in fear, I want to ask you, do you truly know Christ? I'm not asking if you've been going to church for however many years, or if you are been doing all these Christian things all your life. I'm asking, do you truly know Christ? And second, are you making him known? Are you prioritizing your resources, your time, and your energy to making his great name known among all people groups, among all nations? And this text this morning is one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible. And we could pick it apart and look at this or that and try to determine what the end times are going to be like, or how the end times are going to come about, or even when they're going to happen. But we're not going to do that. We need to come to this text humbly this morning and look at the bigger picture. Look at the heart of the message. Just like last week, going through Matthew 23, we could try to analyze every part of it with a narrow mind and try to pick it apart here and there and say, man, those Pharisees missed it. But the better question is, how are we missing it? In the same way today, we can look at this passage and try to pick it apart and look at our culture and say, well, we see this or that happening in our culture, therefore Christ must be coming back at this or that time. In fact, the words that we're going to read this morning have led some people to predict exact dates of when Jesus will return. I read a book a while back called 88 Reasons Why Christ Will Return in 1988. What do you do if you're celebrating New Year's Day with that guy in 1989? I mean, Happy New Year just doesn't quite seem appropriate, okay? But it's not just lunatics out there. Solid, Bible-believing Christians and scholars debate what this or that means in a text like Matthew 24. Is it premillennialism? Is it postmillennialism? Is it amillennialism? Is it post-trib, mid-trib, pre-trib? Is it rapture, no rapture? And there's a place for those questions because the Bible talks about them, and they are important. But we're not going to focus on those today. Again, look at your hearts as we read this passage and ask, am I prepared not only for the next few hours or days or weeks, are you prepared for the next 10 billion years, for all eternity? There's no more important question than these. And my goal this morning is not to answer every single question about every single detail about the end times. My goal is to show you the big picture of what Jesus talked about for the future of your life and the future of the world that we live in. And I want to show you things that you can bank your life on and things that you cannot bank your life on, things that matter and things that don't matter. So let's read this text, the first 35 verses of Matthew 24. And based on this controversial and confusing text, I want to give us 3 words of encouragement this morning based on your life and for the world that we live in. Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of the desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go back down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. For the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform many great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth may pass away, but my words will not pass away." So what does all of this mean? Amidst all the controversy and confusion, I believe there are 3 clear exhortations for us this morning. Number 1, trust in the authority of Christ. Now this is where I want to take a big picture look at what we just read to help us understand how the text is arranged. Okay, so there's 2 main prophecies that Jesus is addressing here, 2 main events that he's talking about. And it's important to distinguish when he's talking about what. So, Understanding the text, admittingly, not every single biblical scholar would agree here. But the majority see a clear distinction between the two prophecies of the two primary events, the first of which is a prophecy concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is what Jesus is talking about, specifically starting in verse 15. So get the scene. In verse 2, Jesus foretold that the temple would be destroyed. And as he and his disciples walk away from Jerusalem up the Mount of Olives, his disciples come to him and ask, when is all this going to happen? So Jesus begins to talk about it. And he starts talking about things that are signs and things that are not signs. And then you get to verse 15, and he says, so, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea and Jerusalem flee to the mountains. So then you get down to verse 21, and he says, then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be. Try saying that 5 times fast. And this clearly is a reference to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple within it. So when he talks about the abomination of desolation by the prophet Daniel, that's an intentional reference to Daniel chapters 8, 9, 11, and 12, where the prophet Daniel, centuries before, foretold a time when a foreign ruler would come into the temple and profane it. And most Jewish people linked that prophecy to something that happened around 168 BC, when a ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes came into the temple, erected a pagan altar on it, and it sacrificed a pig over it, thus defiling the house of God. But it's as if Jesus is saying that's only a foretaste of what's going to happen when Jerusalem is destroyed. And sure enough, about 40 years later, around 70 AD, the Roman armies began surrounding the city of Jerusalem to overtake it. And when they would overtake it, the Roman army would destroy the temple, and instead of making sacrifices to false gods, they would declare Titus, the Roman emperor, as supreme. And Daniel 12:1 uses the same phrase. There will be a time of trouble, such as never been seen until that time. It's the same phrase that's used here in Matthew 24, verse 21. And it was a horrifying, ghastly time. 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem was a virtual bloodbath of Jewish men and women who were pummeled by the Roman army. The Jewish historian Josephus described the savagery, slaughter, disease, and famine that marked the Jewish people during those years. Parents reduced to cannibalism of their own children. Many were taken into slavery, and millions died. This event was way worse than the Holocaust could ever be. So much worse. And all this would take place 40 years or so after Jesus said these words. So here he tells the disciples, when this happens, flee, get out of town. When the Roman army comes to attack the city and destroys the temple, don't even go home and get your clothes. If you're out in the field, just run. And how difficult would it be for pregnant women and for those who strictly observe the Sabbath, saying, well, it's a Sabbath, we can't go anywhere, we can't do anything. Or in the winter, when frequent rains would have caused the flood water or the waters to rise and make it difficult to cross streams and rivers. So the first prophecy here in the chapter is key. Jerusalem will be destroyed. A temple will be obliterated, and not one stone will be left upon another. So this is one prophecy in this passage, and there's also another prophecy concerning the return of Jesus. And this prophecy is clearly described in verses 29 through 31, when Jesus talks about the day when the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And then he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Okay, so that's the prophecy regarding the return of Jesus. And verse 29 talks about how all the light of the world will be dark, and the heavens shaking. So we know it's talking about much more than just the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is the day that Jesus is coming back in splendor and glory with a trumpet call from heaven. He will come to finally and fully assert his reign and his rule over all the earth as the sovereign Son of Man, who deserves the praise of all people. So that's verses 29 through 31. Now the confusing part is how all the rest of the verses fit in with these two prophecies and how they relate to one another. And there's two main schools of thought that concern the rest of these verses, and to be perfectly honest, both make perfect sense. Okay, so instead of talking about either or both of them, I'm not going to talk about either one of them. Okay, and I'm not going to do that because the main point is the same with both of them. One, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and two, Jesus is coming back. That's all what this text is talking about. So why is it important for you and me sitting here in the 21st century? So, applying the text, mark this down, and this is a mammoth reality for you and I to realize here in this room. The things of this world are passing. Okay, this is huge. Think about these disciples. Put yourselves in their shoes. Country boys from Galilee who come to the big city of Jerusalem. And they're stunned by the splendor, particularly the splendor of the temple. And they had reason to be. It'd be like me growing up in northwest Kansas, never seeing a building more than 2 stories tall, and I've never even seen a picture of anything bigger than that, and then going to New York City and seeing the skyscrapers for the first time. That's equivalent of what they were seeing when they saw the temple. It was a massive, awe-inspiring, breathtaking edifice, built with stones, some of which were 40 feet long, 12 feet deep, and 12 feet wide, weighing over 200,000 pounds each. Try imagining moving those without modern-day equipment. Okay, there weren't Caterpillars or John Deeres in the first century. There's no dump trucks or semi-trailers or cranes, yet they stacked massive stone on top of massive stone, all leading to a roof bathed in a sea of golden glory. The white marble on the top of the temple would virtually blind you when you looked at it in the reflection of the sun. So the disciples of Jesus see this at the beginning of the chapter, and they're like, man, what an amazing building. And then Jesus says, you see all these stones? Not a single one of them is going to be stacked upon another. They're all going to be obliterated. So the things of this world, not even the best, most incredible things will be left. They're all passing. Things that you and I marvel at. Things that you and I treasure. Things that you and I are building our lives upon are all passing away. One of the key verses in this whole passage of Matthew is Matthew 24, verse 35. 24, verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away. Did you hear that? The world and everything in it, all its splendor, all its majesty, with the trees and mountains and oceans and rivers, all of its riches, it's all fading away. Heaven and earth will pass away, but, now listen to this, but my words will not pass away. The things of this world are passing away, but the truth of the word of God is permanent. Regardless of how someone might interpret these details or that detail in this text, it's clear Jesus accurately foretold the destruction of the temple in the city of Jerusalem. Those stones would pass away, the city would pass away, the people who filled that city would pass away, but his words would remain. Jesus is not some fortune teller in the French Quarter or some tarot card reader down in downtown New Orleans. He is the Lord of history, and he speaks with authority about the future. He knows the future, he ordains the future, and he brings it to pass. Heaven and earth will pass away, but his word will not pass away. So, build your life not on the things of this world, not on the riches of this world, not on the pleasures of this world, on the plans and recognitions of this world. Do not build your life on those things. Don't waste your life on those things. They're all going to burn up in the end. Build your life on what matters, the words of Christ. That's why I say to every single person in this room, trust in the authority of Christ. He spoke about the destruction of Jerusalem, and it happened. And he spoke about his return one day, and it will happen. Mark it down. It will happen. So, are you ready? And on that day, which we'll talk about in a minute, could be any day, are you going to be ready? Will you have built your life, banked your life on that which is passing or that which is permanent? I urge you, trust in the authority of Christ. Build your life, spend your life on what will last, not that which is passing. So, how do you get ready for that day when Jesus comes back? That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. The second clear exhortation from Jesus' words here in this passage are persevere in the power of Christ. So I hope you see the significance of everything else Jesus is saying in this passage. He's preparing his disciples for that time in Jerusalem of the destruction, and in those same words, he's preparing disciples for all times for his return. These words of warning about signs, preparing what to know, and preparing knowing what to expect apply to all people all the time. So these disciples that day needed to be ready for the destruction of Israel, the destruction of Israel, and to persevere through other circumstances. And though other followers of Christ in other times of history, like you and me here today, will face different historical challenges, much of it will be the same. And so the encouragement from Jesus all over this passage is to persevere. Now, as I've mentioned, a lot of people take this text and try to piece it together in order to conclude that, okay, so once these certain things happen, then Jesus will return. But I don't think that's the point. The point is not for us to read this passage and try to set a date for when Jesus will return. Jesus himself says in verse 36, which we'll look at next week, concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. So Jesus says, I don't even know when the end is going to come. So why are we trying to predict when it's going to happen? But the point is not for this text to lead to date setting. The point is for you and I to walk away from this text knowing what is going to happen before Jesus comes back. It's not that as soon as these things happen, he's going to return, but these things will all happen before he returns. I hope that makes sense. And what's going to happen was clear to these disciples in the first century and should be clear to all of us here in the 21st century. So, followers of Jesus then and now and until Jesus comes back will face deception. Now we're overviewing all that we see in the surrounding passages in these two prophecies. Verse 4 says, many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Don't be led astray. He says the same thing in verses 23 through 25. People say, look, here's the Christ, but don't believe them. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform many great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Don't believe them. Don't be led astray, and don't be deceived. And it's not just Jim Jones or David Koresh or other clearly false teachers. It's people all over the place who promote a picture of Jesus or a version of Jesus that's not found in the Scriptures. And they're deceiving millions of people, are eating it up. So, followers of Jesus will face deception, and followers of Jesus will face tribulation. That's a clear theme in this passage. Whether in 1st century Jerusalem or 21st century world, life will not be easy. Wars and rumors of wars, nations rising against nations, famines and earthquakes. These things were familiar to them, and they're familiar to us, aren't they? Wars and rumors of wars across the Middle East and with Israel and Iran and North Korea. Nations rising against nations, famine in parts of China, or in parts of Africa over the last year, where hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children starved and are starving. We're not immune to tribulation in this world, and no one is. Expect these things, Jesus says. Not in a way that, well, since this happened in Myanmar, and this happened in China, and what's happening right now in North Korea, clearly Jesus is coming back. Maybe he is, but that's not the point. The point is not to lead us to date setting. The point here is to remind us how to live and what to expect in this fallen world in the time before Jesus comes back. And he says, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. What an astonishing statement. Famine everywhere, natural disasters rampant, rumors of nuclear war, but don't be alarmed. Don't let your life go up and down based on political trends or potential disasters. These things are not to alarm you. They're part of what Romans 8 calls the groaning of creation for redemption from the Creator. Mark it down. Christians are not saved from trials. Christians are saved through trials. In other words, Jesus is saying, trust in me. Do not be alarmed. Even when it seems like everything is out of control, I am still in control. These things are to be expected. Pain and hurt and suffering and tribulation will happen all over the world. And it will not be easy for you. Wars will come. Famines will happen. Earthquakes will come. Cancer will happen.